My name is Catherine Mitchell, and I'm telling you this story from my apartment in Portland, Oregon. The one I paid for in full while my husband signed the lease like it was a signature for a greeting card. I didn't raise my voice when he told me to leave. I didn't argue when his mother and sister walked through my front door like they owned the place. I simply picked up my Gucci bag, the one he gave me on our anniversary, probably using our joint account, and I walked out into the Portland rain without so much as a goodbye. Because exactly 1 hour later, while they were celebrating inside what they thought was their victory, I was sitting in a Starbucks on Belmont Avenue with my laptop open, watching everything unfold on my security feed. And let me tell you something. When you have access to the cameras, the locks, the elevator system, and 37 pages of documentation that proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that you own the building, the apartment, and technically the couch they were sitting on, you have something much more powerful than anger. You have patience. You have leverage. And most importantly, you have the kind of quiet power that makes people absolutely lose their minds when they finally realize they've been completely outplayed. But before I tell you how I got here, I need you to understand something. I wasn't born knowing how to do this. I had to learn it. And I learned it from someone who should have known better. I learned it from my mother. Let me take you back to where this all started, because none of this makes sense without understanding who I was before I became the woman who calmly locked her entire family out of her own home on a Thursday night in September. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in a modest 3-bedroom house on a street where everyone knew everyone else's business. My mother, Patricia, was the kind of woman who raised me to be independent, to never rely on a man for anything, to always keep my own bank account separate, to sign every document myself, and to never, ever let anyone else's name go on anything that mattered. She said it like it was the most important lesson she could teach me, more important than how to cook, more important than how to be kind, more important than how to love. She'd sit at our kitchen table in Columbus, drinking her Folgers coffee, and she'd tell me stories about women she knew who made the mistake of letting their husbands take control. One woman, Sandra Thompson from next door, lost her house in a divorce because her name wasn't on the deed. Another woman, Michelle from her book club, watched her entire business get handed to her ex-husband because she'd been too trusting. My mother repeated these stories like they were warnings carved into stone. "Catherine," she'd say, gripping my arm just a little too tight, "never put your name second to a man's. Never. Do you understand me?" I understood. I understood so well that by the time I was 32 years old, sitting in a glass office building in downtown Seattle working as a financial analyst for Amazon, I had built a financial fortress that would make most CPAs jealous. I had investment accounts, I had a 401k maxed out, I had a money market account with 6 months of living expenses in it, and I had an absolutely meticulous system for tracking every dollar I earned. When I met Marcus at a networking event in 2015, he was charming. He was handsome. He was the kind of man who made you feel like the world was suddenly bigger and more interesting than it had been 5 minutes before. Marcus Thompson, that was his name, and yes, I should have caught the minor coincidence that his last name was Thompson, and I'd spent my entire childhood hearing about women named Thompson who'd lost everything, but I was busy being in love, which is the most dangerous thing a woman raised by Patricia can be. Marcus was charismatic. He worked in tech marketing, the kind of job that gave him the ability to talk to anyone about anything and make them feel like they were the most important person in the room. When we got married 2 years later, it was at a boutique venue in Seattle, and my mother sat in the front row looking like she'd been asked to attend her own funeral. After the wedding, after Marcus carried me over the threshold of our starter apartment, a nice 2-bedroom in Queen, and that I'd already started looking into purchasing, naturally, my mother pulled me aside. "You got a prenup, right?" she asked. I had. Because I was Patricia's daughter, and Patricia had made it very clear that love was important, but paperwork was essential. Marcus had signed it without even reading it. That should have been my first warning. That should have been the moment I realized that the kind of man who doesn't write a prenup is the kind of man who doesn't actually care about the details of his own life, which means someone else is going to have to care about them instead. But I was happy. For 3 years, I was genuinely happy. We were compatible. We had fun together. We went to Pike Place Market on Saturdays and drank coffee from that famous Seattle chain everyone talks about, though Marcus always said the coffee was overrated and the crowds were unbearable. He was right about both things, but I loved him for saying it anyway. Then, in 2020, right when the pandemic was turning Seattle into a ghost town, and we were all supposed to be staying home and reevaluating our entire existence, Marcus mentioned that he'd like to move somewhere warmer. He mentioned it casually, the way you might mention wanting Thai food for dinner, like it wasn't a decision that would change everything. Portland, he said. Like, why are we in Seattle paying these prices for this weather? Portland has the same vibe, better weed, cheaper everything, and actually it's where my mother and sister are thinking about moving anyway. His mother was Diane Thompson, a woman I'd met exactly 4 times in the 3 years I'd been married to Marcus. His sister was Tiffany Thompson, a woman I'd met exactly twice, and both times she'd looked at me like I was something that had been stuck to the bottom of her shoe. They lived in Denver at the time, but apparently they were having some kind of spiritual crisis that they believed could only be solved by moving to a place where people wore Birkenstocks and had strong opinions about locally sourced craft beer. My mother's been struggling since the divorce, Marcus told me, and this was the first I was hearing about any of this. Marcus had never mentioned that his mother was going through a divorce. He'd mentioned a lot of other things about his mother, mostly complaints about her constant neediness and her inability to respect boundaries, but somehow the detail that she was actively dismantling her marriage had not made it into our dinner conversations. This should have been a cliffhanger moment. This should have been the moment I realized that Marcus was not telling me important information about the people who were about to become much more present in our lives. But I was thinking about the Portland real estate market, which I'd been following casually, because that's what I do. I follow markets the way other people follow celebrity gossip. Portland real estate was actually incredible in 2020. Prices were rising, interest rates were low, and the city was becoming increasingly attractive to tech workers who were now realizing they could live anywhere. I saw opportunity. That's the problem with being raised by Patricia and having worked in finance for a decade. You see everything as a problem that can be solved with the right financial structure. Okay, I said to Marcus. Let's move to Portland. But if we move, I'm buying property. Something that's actually an investment, not a rental. And it's going with on my name only because that's what my prenup allows, and that's what makes sense financially. I said this calmly. I said this reasonably. I said this like I was explaining a tax code to a junior analyst. And Marcus, who is apparently not someone who read prenups or paid attention to the details of his own financial future, simply nodded and said, "Sure, babe. Whatever makes sense." What I should have understood in that moment is that Marcus had never in his entire life been forced to actually understand financial documents. His mother had managed his childhood money. His previous girlfriend, according to random conversation details he dropped over 3 years, had managed the finances in that relationship. And now here I was, about to manage the finances in this one, which meant he could coast along pretending he understood money, while actually understanding nothing except how to be charming and say the right things at parties. We moved to Portland in November 2020, which is the absolute worst time to move anywhere because the weather is gray and wet, and everyone is in a pandemic funk. We rented a temporary apartment in the Pearl District while I began my search for the exact right property. I was looking for something specific. A luxury apartment building, something newer, something with smart home technology that I could integrate with a security system, something that was appreciating in value, something that would make sense as a long-term investment. I wasn't looking to live in a McMansion like other people moving to Portland. I was looking to build wealth. And I found it, a 7-year-old luxury apartment building called the Meridian, right on the South Park blocks, 23 stories, full building automation, concierge service, and a penthouse-adjacent corner unit on the 21st floor with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Portland like you were literally floating above the city. The unit was $1.2 million. I had $600,000 saved, and I was approved for a $600,000 mortgage in approximately 15 minutes, which is what happens when you have perfect credit, a substantial down payment, and you work for a company that apparently makes enough money to lend to anyone with a pulse. The paperwork was straightforward. Catherine Mitchell, single name on the deed. Catherine Mitchell, single name on the mortgage. Catherine Mitchell, single name on every single legal document. Marcus signed a few things. I don't even remember what. He was distracted because his mother had arrived in Portland the week before, and she was in a state about the divorce proceedings, and she was already making comments about how at least Marcus had found a stable woman, which was a compliment wrapped in an insult wrapped in a threat about expectations. We closed on the apartment in January 2021. The keys arrived in a beautiful leather portfolio. The security system was set to my fingerprint and my phone. The smart home system was synced to my email address. The concierge knew to call me for any building decisions. And for about 18 months, everything was perfect. Marcus loved living there. He threw parties, which is something I tolerated because I understood that I was married to a man who needed an audience and who used social gatherings to feel alive. His mother and sister came to visit, and they made comments about how impressive the apartment was, which sounded like they were calculating the resale value rather than actually being impressed. His sister Tiffany, especially, had a way of touching the furniture like she was appraising it, running her fingers along the leather sofa we'd bought from a designer in Portland named Blue, and asking questions like, so if something happened, like, hypothetically, who would this belong to? These were strange questions, but I was starting to realize that Diane and Tiffany Thompson were generally strange people. They were the kind of people who made you feel vaguely uncomfortable, the kind of people who smiled but never meant it, the kind of people who asked personal questions not because they cared about the answers, but because they were gathering intelligence. Marcus told me I was being paranoid. Marcus said his mother was just excited about his life finally being stable. Marcus said his sister was just naturally curious. Marcus said a lot of things that sounded good, but meant nothing. Then, in July 2022, something shifted. It was so subtle that I almost didn't notice it, except I notice everything. It's who I was trained to be. Marcus started talking differently about the apartment. He started saying our place instead of your place. He started mentioning it in conversations with his mother like he'd been part of the decision to buy it, like he'd contributed something to the purchase beyond his signature on documents he didn't read. He started talking about it like it was his, in the way that men who have never had to worry about money talk about things. And then in September 2022, exactly 2 years after we'd moved to Portland, exactly 18 months after we'd closed on the apartment, his mother and sister announced they were moving to Portland. Not to an apartment of their own. They had a plan which Diane explained to me while we were all standing in my apartment, because that's where they kept announcing major life decisions, like my apartment was somehow also their apartment, with the kind of confidence that told me this plan had already been decided without me. We're going to start a business here, Diane announced. She was holding a glass of Prosecco that I'd purchased and opened, so I guess technically I was supporting her as she told me about her plan for my life. A wellness center. Yoga, meditation, that kind of thing. Very Portland. Marcus is going to help us with the marketing and the branding. I looked at Marcus, who was suddenly very interested in the view from the window, which was strange because he'd seen this view approximately 800 times. And we're going to need a place to live, Diane continued. Nothing fancy, just something temporary while we get the business off the ground. Tiffany smiled. It was the smile of someone who had already rehearsed this conversation with her mother multiple times. Maybe we could just stay here for a bit, she said. I mean, Marcus basically lives here anyway, right? This is his home. We wouldn't want to burden him with extra rent. I should have said no immediately. I should have laughed or made a joke or done something that made clear that my apartment was not a hostel for the Thompson family. But I'm trained by decades of Patricia's financial wisdom to pick my battles, to understand that saying no to small things often prevents people from asking for bigger things. I made a decision that would end my marriage in ways that would have made my mother proud and heartbroken in equal measure. You can stay for 2 weeks, I said, while you find a place. But 2 weeks only. And then you need to move out and find your own apartment. Diane looked at me like I'd just told her that we were flying to the moon. 2 weeks, she said. Honey, we're going to need at least a month. 2 weeks, I repeated. Diane smiled. It was the smile of someone who had never been told no in her entire life and was deeply curious about what would happen if she simply ignored what she'd just heard. That should have been the warning. That should have been the moment I realized that the Thompson family operated under a different set of rules than other people, rules that existed in some parallel universe where no one ever said no, and everyone just gave them what they wanted eventually anyway. They arrived with luggage on a Thursday. By Sunday, it was clear they'd never intended to leave. Tiffany had moved into the guest bedroom like she was claiming territory in a colonization project. Diane had taken over the kitchen and was reorganizing all my cabinets, explaining that she was just reorganizing things so we can find them easily, which is what people say when they're actually asserting dominance over your space. Marcus watched all of this and said nothing. The 2 weeks turned into a month. The month turned into 2 months. The 2 months turned into just until we signed the lease on our place, and the lease on our place never seemed to actually happen, despite multiple conversations where Diane assured me they'd found something perfect. Something was just falling through for mysterious reasons that had nothing to do with the fact that they were apparently now living rent-free in a $1.2 million apartment. By October, I'd had enough. I told Marcus we needed to have a serious conversation. We sat on that blued sofa that Tiffany kept running her fingers across, and I explained, calmly, rationally, using the exact framework Patricia had taught me, that his mother and sister needed to leave. I've been patient, I said. I've been generous. But this is my property, and I've allowed it to be invaded, and it needs to stop. Marcus looked at me like I'd asked him to cut off his own arm. You want me to tell my mother to leave? Do you understand what you're asking me to do? This is the question that should have ended everything right there. This is the moment I should have understood that Marcus was not going to prioritize our marriage or our home or my boundaries, because asking him to maintain those boundaries on his behalf would be asking him to disappoint his mother, and he would literally never do that. But I was hoping. I was holding on to the possibility that he loved me more than he loved his mother's approval. Yes, I said. I'm asking you to tell your mother to leave. Or I will do it for you, but it's not going to be pleasant. Marcus didn't tell his mother to leave. What he did instead was something far worse. He had a conversation with her where he apparently communicated my boundaries in a way that made her feel like I was being unreasonable, and then she decided to take action. That action came on a Thursday night in September, exactly 11 months after they'd arrived with luggage that never got unpacked, exactly 1 month before it would have been a full year, exactly when I was reaching the absolute limit of my patience. Marcus arrived home with his mother and sister already in the apartment. Not arriving with him. Already there. Which meant he'd let them in beforehand, which meant he'd planned something, which meant I needed to pay very close attention to what happened next. Catherine, he said, using my full name, which is how you know the conversation is about to be serious and unpleasant. We need to talk about the living situation. My mother and sister need more time. The business is just getting started. They can't afford to move out right now. And honestly, I don't think it's fair that you're forcing the issue. I looked around the apartment. I looked at his mother sitting on my sofa like she'd been invited to stay forever. I looked at his sister standing by the window, running her fingers along the curtains. I looked at my husband, the man I'd married, the man I'd trusted enough to put my name on documents with, and I understood in that moment that I'd made a catastrophic error. I'd married a man who would never actually be on my side. I'd married a man who would choose his mother's comfort over his wife's clear boundaries. I'd married a man who would gaslight me into thinking that asking people to leave a space I owned was somehow unreasonable. And so when Marcus said, his voice calm but with that underlying edge of control, "My mother and sister don't want you here. I think you need to leave for a while and give everyone some space." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't scream, or throw things, or do any of the things that might have made him feel bad about what he was saying. I simply looked at him and nodded. "Okay," I said. "You're right. I'm going to leave. I'm going to take some space. And while I'm gone, I'm going to do something very productive with my time." I walked to the bedroom, pulled my Gucci bag, the one he'd given me, the one with a $3,000 price tag that he'd paid for using money from our joint account, which was technically money that I'd earned, and I walked right back past all three of them to the door. Diane called out something about how I was being dramatic, but I was already in the elevator. I was already descending 21 floors. I was already thinking about the coffee shop on Belmont Avenue where I could sit with my laptop and watch absolutely everything unfold in real time. The security system at the Meridian is state-of-the-art. It's a company called Vivint, based in Provo, Utah, the kind of system that integrates with smart home technology and allows you to access literally everything from your phone. I had set it up personally. I had entered all the codes. I had verified every camera. I had tested the locks. And most importantly, I had made absolutely certain that it was all synced to my phone and my email only, which is something that Marcus, his mother, and his sister had no idea about. I sat at that Starbucks on Belmont Avenue, ordering a Veni cold brew, which I drank while thinking about how Marcus had told me coffee from Starbucks was overrated, and I opened my app. The security feed showed everything. It showed Marcus and his mother and his sister laughing. It showed them celebrating in my apartment like they'd won some kind of victory. And then, very calmly, I started to make phone calls. The first call was to my lawyer, a woman named Rachel Shapiro who worked for a firm called Samuels and Associates in downtown Portland. Rachel had drafted my prenup. Rachel understood every aspect of my financial situation. Rachel was also a woman who, when I explained what had just happened, said something that made me understand why my mother had been so intense about all of this. He just handed you grounds for a permanent restraining order. The fact that he tried to exclude you from your own property is actually incredible. We can use this. The second call was to a company called Safeguard Tech in Seattle, a digital evidence preservation company that specializes in security footage and timestamps. I paid them $400 to create an official, legally admissible record of every single thing happening in my apartment right now, stamped with the time, date, and geographic data from my phone. The third call was to the concierge at the Meridian. "Hi," I said in the calmest voice possible, the voice of someone who had never been more angry or more in control in her entire life. "This is Catherine Mitchell from Unit 2114. I need you to confirm that my husband and his family do not have override access to the security system or the elevator on their key fob alone." There was a moment of silence while the concierge checked something. "No, Ms. Mitchell. Override access requires a code that syncs with your phone. Standard setup for security." "Thank you," I said. "I'm about to conduct an experiment in how power works, and I need this information for the record." I waited exactly 45 minutes. I finished my coffee. I read 3 chapters of a book I'd been meaning to get to. I listened to a podcast about financial crimes. And then, very methodically, I used the Vivint app to change the building access permissions. I locked every door. I disabled the elevator access for everyone except me. I turned on the intercom so that I could hear everything they were saying, and most importantly, so that they could hear me when I decided to speak. The reaction was immediate. On the camera feed, I watched Marcus notice that the door had locked. I watched him try to open it. I watched him try to use his key fob on the elevator. I watched the moment when his face changed from confusion to something that looked a lot like fear. "The door's locked," he said to his mother, speaking to her like she might have an explanation. Diane looked confused. "Did you lock it when you came in?" Marcus checked. "No. No, I definitely didn't lock it." Tiffany went to the window and looked out. She was probably hoping to see me out there, some physical evidence of where I'd gone. But I wasn't there. I was here, in a Starbucks on Belmont Avenue, holding all of the power. I gave them 30 minutes of confusion. 30 minutes of them trying to figure out what had happened, why they couldn't leave, why the elevator was refusing to register their key fobs. Then I turned on the intercom. My voice came through the speaker in the apartment, calm and clear. The voice of someone who owned the space, who had paid for it, who had every legal right to control who came and went. "I'm Catherine Mitchell," I said. "And you're standing in my apartment without my permission. This building is on my ownership deed, registered under my name, through a mortgage in my name, in a state where marital property laws are very specific about separate property established before marriage." There was silence. Complete silence. I could see on the camera feed that all 3 of them were standing still, like they couldn't quite process that sound was coming from the walls. "You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings and exit through the front door," I continued. "Security will be in the lobby to assist you. The concierge has been instructed that you no longer have access to this building. Catherine Mitchell out." I ended the intercom transmission. And then I watched what happened next on my security feed. Marcus started to say something to his mother. His mother's face went from confused to angry to something else entirely, something that looked like the moment when she realized that her son had married a woman she couldn't push around. Tiffany sat down on my sofa, the blue sofa that she'd been running her fingers across for months, and put her head in her hands. And Marcus, my husband, the man I'd promised to build a life with, understood in that moment that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He'd thought that living in my apartment meant it was also his apartment. He'd thought that marrying me meant he got a say in how I managed my own property. He'd thought that his mother's presence and his sister's attitude was enough to override the fact that my name was the only name on every single document that mattered. And he'd learned, very quickly, what it means to confuse a quiet woman's patience with weakness. They packed in 48 minutes. They didn't try to argue further. They didn't call lawyers. They didn't do anything except gather their things and leave. Marcus looked at me when he reached the door. I'd opened it remotely once they'd packed, and he said something like, "How could you do this?" And I replied with something that Patricia had taught me years ago, something that had settled into my bones and my business sense and my understanding of power. "I didn't do anything to you. You did this to yourself. You just didn't realize who you were messing with until it was too late." The divorce proceedings took 4 months. Rachel Shapiro was exceptional. The recorded audio, the security footage, the legal documentation that proved Marcus was never on any deed, never contributed to any mortgage, the prenup that he'd signed without reading. All of it came together to create a case so clear that Marcus's own lawyer apparently recommended he settle quickly and quietly. I kept the apartment. He paid me alimony because apparently you have to, despite the prenup, in some situations involving length of marriage and disparity in earning. I changed all the locks. I upgraded the security system even further. And most importantly, I learned what my mother had been trying to teach me my entire life. Power isn't loud. Power is quiet. Power is knowing the details. Power is reading the documents. Power is understanding that ownership is something you claim by being smart enough to get your name on the paper and brave enough to enforce it when someone tries to take it from you. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue with the lessons I learned about power that no financial course could ever teach me.